To switch VIP seats for a white passenger one call later, the entire team is fired. Imagine this. A seat in first class isn't just a seat, it's a battleground. One man with a legacy of overcoming faces off against an empire of entitlement. In a twist no one saw coming. Power dynamics are flipped, and karma delivers its verdict in mid-air. Don't miss out on this tale of quiet courage that shook the very foundations of privilege. If this story of standing up for what's right resonates with you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more gripping narratives, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because sometimes the most powerful revolution starts with just one seat. The soft hum of the airplane engines filled the air as Snoop Dogg settled into his plush first-class seat. He exhaled deeply, savoring a moment of peace after a grueling week of back-to-back gigs. His window seat offered a perfect view of the airport tarmac, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. It was a moment he had earned, a small luxury he allowed himself after years of relentless hard work. Snoop's life hadn't always been this way. He grew up in Long Beach, his parents instilling in him a fierce determination to rise above the limitations society often imposed. As a legendary rapper now standing as a symbol of resilience and success, this flight was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter. A trip to finalize a major international concert series that could propel his career to unprecedented heights. He adjusted his iconic shades and reached for his leather briefcase, the scent of fresh coffee lingering in the cabin, mingling with the faint aroma of designer perfumes worn by his fellow passengers. A steward passed by, offering a warm smile as he handed Snoop a glass of sparkling water. Snoop accepted it with a nod, savoring the crisp bubbles against his lips. Everything felt perfect, but perfection, as Snoop would soon learn, could be fleeting. A commotion at the front of the cabin snapped him out of his thoughts. Snoop glanced up, his gaze locking onto a tall blonde woman entering the first-class section. Her posture screamed entitlement, her designer handbag dangling from her elbow as if it were a badge of honor. Behind her trailed a slightly shorter companion. Their whispered conversation was just loud enough for Snoop to catch snippets of it. "Can you believe the airline? This seat assignment is ridiculous," the blonde muttered, her voice dripping with disdain. Her companion, a brunette with a nervous laugh, replied, "I know, Brooke, but maybe it's just a mistake. They'll fix it." Snoop felt a prickle of unease as the two women stopped beside his row. Brooke's sharp gaze flicked to Snoop, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping impatiently against her handbag. Snoop returned his attention to the briefcase on his lap, unwilling to engage. He had dealt with people like Brooke before, people who saw his fame and skin color before his accomplishments, who assumed his place in the world was up for negotiation. "Excuse me," Brooke said, her tone clipped. Snoop looked up, meeting her gaze. "Yeah," Snoop replied, his voice calm and measured. "I believe there's been a mistake," Brooke said, gesturing towards Snoop's seat. "This is obviously meant for someone else." Snoop arched an eyebrow. "This is my seat, 1A. I reserved it weeks ago." Brooke's lips curled into a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You see, I'm a gold-tier member with this airline. I always get priority seating. You might be more comfortable elsewhere." Snoop stared at her for a moment, letting the weight of the woman's audacity sink in. "I'm quite comfortable where I am, thank you." Brooke's smile vanished. Her companion shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing to avoid further conflict. Before Brooke could respond, a flight attendant appeared, his crisp uniform adding an air of authority. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, his gaze darting between the two. "Yes, there is," Brooke said, her voice taking on a dramatic lilt. "This seat, my seat, has been mistakenly assigned to someone else. I need it resolved immediately." The attendant glanced at Snoop, who offered a calm but pointed response. "There's no mistake. This is my seat, and I have the ticket to prove it." The attendant hesitated, caught between Brooke's assertiveness and Snoop's quiet confidence. "Let me check your ticket again, sir," he said to Snoop, his tone polite, but faintly skeptical. Snoop handed over his boarding pass without a word, his heart steady despite the growing tension. He had been here before in studios, on stages, in countless subtle confrontations where he had to prove he belonged. This was just another test. The attendant examined the ticket and nodded. "This is indeed your seat, mister. Dogg. Brooke's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, her polished veneer cracked. That can't be right. He must have bought a last-minute upgrade. People do that, don't they? Snoop bit back a sharp retort, instead fixing Brooke with a steady gaze. I suggest you take your assigned seat. This conversation is over. Brooke's companion tugged at her arm, whispering something inaudible, but Brooke wasn't ready to let it go. I'm not sure you understand who I am, she said, her voice low but seething. I always fly first class. I'm not about to let someone like Brooke, her friend hissed, cutting her off. The flight attendant cleared his throat. I'm sorry, ma'am, but if you have any further concerns, you're welcome to speak with our supervisor. Brooke glared at him, her frustration barely contained. Finally, with a huff, she stormed toward the front of the cabin, dragging her reluctant companion behind her. The flight attendant gave Snoop an apologetic look before retreating to handle other duties. Snoop watched them go, his expression unreadable. He could feel the stares of the other passengers, their curiosity heavy in the air. It wasn't the first time he had been singled out in such a way, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But Snoop wasn't about to let anyone diminish him. Not today. Not ever. Leaning back in his seat, he took a sip of his water and closed his eyes. This was far from over, and deep down, he knew it. Snoop leaned back in his seat, flipping through the pages of a sleek, leather-bound notebook he carried everywhere. His meticulous handwriting filled the pages with notes, strategies, and ideas for the upcoming concerts. As he adjusted his reading glasses, a faint commotion caught his attention near the entrance of the first-class cabin. The door had just opened to allow the remaining passengers to board. A tall, elegantly dressed woman with platinum blonde hair swept into the cabin, flanked by another woman carrying an oversized designer tote. The first woman moved with an air of entitlement, her head tilted high as if the world existed solely to cater to her needs. She paused in the aisle, her sharp gaze scanning the rows like a hawk searching for prey. Snoop caught the subtle narrowing of the woman's eyes as they landed on him. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered that look, a mix of curiosity and judgment laced with the unspoken question, "What are you doing here?" "Excuse me," the woman said sharply, waving at a passing flight attendant. Her voice was cultured but carried a distinct edge of impatience. "This must be a mistake. My seat is supposed to be here." The flight attendant, a young man with neatly combed hair and a slightly nervous demeanor, smiled politely. "What seat number, ma'am?" "1A, of course. I always book 1A, she replied, her tone dismissive. She gestured vaguely towards Snoop, her manicured finger pointed like an accusation. "But clearly there's been a mix-up." Snoop's heart sank. He knew where this was going before it even began. The flight attendant checked his tablet and smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but 1A is correctly assigned. Mr. Dogg here booked it in advance." The woman's jaw tightened. "And what am I supposed to do about that?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "I'm a loyal customer of this airline. A very loyal customer. Surely there's some accommodation you can make." The attendant shifted uncomfortably. "We can try to arrange something, but there's nothing to arrange," Snoop interrupted, his voice calm but firm. He looked up, meeting the woman's gaze squarely. "This is my seat, and I intend to keep it." The woman blinked as if startled that Snoop had spoken. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I'm sure you'd be more comfortable in another seat, perhaps in business class." Snoop's expression didn't waver. He had spent years navigating boardrooms filled with people who underestimated him, and this moment was no different. "I'm perfectly comfortable where I am," he said evenly. The air around them seemed to shift, the quiet tension of the first-class cabin turning sharp. Other passengers pretended not to notice, their eyes glued to their tablets and books, but Snoop felt their curiosity, their silent judgment, like a weight pressing on him. "Let me handle this," the flight attendant said quickly, trying to de-escalate the situation. He turned to Snoop, his voice polite but carrying an undertone that grated on him. "Mr. Dogg, would you mind moving to another seat? Perhaps 2C. It's still in first class and it would allow us to accommodate Mrs. Nicole." So that was her name, Mrs. Brooke Stone, the kind of name that came with country clubs and generational wealth, Snoop thought. Snoop leaned back in his seat and folded his arms. "I booked this seat for a reason," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I won't be moving." Brooke's face darkened. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Snoop to hear. She turned to the flight attendant. "Do you even know who I am?" "I'm a Platinum Elite member. I don't think this is how you want to treat one of your most loyal customers." The attendant swallowed, glancing between Brooke and Snoop, his hesitation saying everything. He knew Brooke had connections, yet he also knew Snoop was within his rights. But in this unspoken power dynamic, Snoop could already feel where his loyalty lay. "I'll get the supervisor," he said at last, retreating down the aisle. Brooke turned back to Snoop, her lips curling into a forced smile. "You could have avoided all this, you know," she said, her tone saccharine and insincere. "But I suppose some people just don't understand the meaning of compromise." Snoop tilted his head, studying the woman before him. "Compromise," he repeated softly, as if testing the word. Interesting choice of words. Brooke's smile faltered. She opened her mouth to retort, but the arrival of the flight supervisor cut her off. A middle-aged woman with a crisp uniform and an air of authority approached, her heels clicking against the cabin floor. "Is there a problem here?" the supervisor asked, glancing between Snoop and Brooke. Before anyone could respond, Brooke jumped in. "Yes, there's a problem. I'm supposed to be in seat 1A, but somehow he ended up here." The supervisor's gaze landed on Snoop, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Mr. Dogg, would you be willing to move to another seat just to resolve this quickly?" Snoop's fingers tightened around the armrest. He looked at the supervisor, then at Brooke, and then at the other passengers who were still pretending not to listen. He could feel their silent expectations, the unspoken demand for him to be reasonable, to yield for the sake of keeping the peace. "No," he said simply. Brooke let out a sharp laugh. "Unbelievable," she repeated, shaking her head. "You're really going to make a scene over this?" "Fine, let's see how far this gets you." Snoop smiled faintly, though his eyes remained steely. He reached for his phone and began typing a message, his calm demeanor never wavering as the tension around him grew thicker. He had dealt with people like Brooke before, and he knew exactly how to handle them. The supervisor, Megan Rose, shifted uncomfortably on her polished black heels. The weight of the escalating tension pressed down on her. As a seasoned airline professional, Megan had dealt with her share of difficult passengers, but something about this situation felt different. She could sense that Brooke Stone wasn't just another disgruntled traveler. She was the kind of customer who believed she deserved preferential treatment simply because she existed. Megan turned her attention to Snoop, who remained seated with an air of calm authority. There was something unshakable about him, a quiet power that seemed to command the space without him needing to raise his voice. Megan hesitated. "Mr. Dogg," she began cautiously, keeping her tone neutral, "I understand your position, but for the sake of resolving this quickly, would you reconsider moving to another seat? It's still in first class and—" "No," Snoop interrupted, his tone firm but devoid of anger. He didn't even look up from his phone, where he was still typing out a message. The supervisor's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flickering to Brooke, who was now pacing a small circle in the aisle, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Brooke's face was a mix of indignation and impatience, as though she couldn't fathom why this conversation was taking so long. "Megan," Brooke interjected, her voice dripping with entitlement, "I don't understand why this is even a discussion. He's being unreasonable. I'm a Platinum Elite member. You know what that means, don't you? I've spent more on this airline than he probably makes in a year. I deserve that seat." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Several passengers in the cabin exchanged uneasy glances, though none of them dared to intervene. Snoop finally looked up, his gaze locking onto Brooke's with startling intensity. "Mrs. Nicole," Snoop said slowly, his voice smooth but laced with steel, "your membership status has nothing to do with me. I paid for this seat, just like you paid for yours. If the airline made a mistake, that's their problem, not mine." Brooke's cheeks flushed, her composure slipping. "This isn't about the money," she snapped. "It's about respect." Brooke's cheeks flushed, her composure slipping. "This isn't about the money," she snapped. "It's about respect. People like you, people like me," Snoop repeated softly, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of a thunderclap. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Even Megan seemed to shrink under Snoop's gaze. Brooke hesitated, floundering for words. "I didn't mean it like that," she stammered, her confidence faltering. "I just meant, well, you're clearly not a frequent flyer in first class." And I, Snoop, held up a hand, cutting her off. "Stop," he said firmly. "You've said enough." The authority in his voice made Brooke recoil, but the woman quickly masked her discomfort with a haughty toss of her head. "Fine," Brooke said, turning back to Megan. "Are you going to let him get away with this?" Megan felt the eyes of the entire cabin on her, the weight of expectation crushing her. She had been trained to de-escalate situations, to prioritize customer satisfaction above all else. But this wasn't an ordinary dispute. She could see that Snoop wasn't just another passenger to be placated or dismissed. There was something in the way he carried himself, something that warned Megan against pushing too far. "I'm afraid Mr. Dogg has the right to remain in his seat," Megan said at last, her voice carefully measured. "He booked it, and we cannot force him to move." Brooke's face twisted in fury. "Unbelievable!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. "This is the kind of service I get after all the money I've spent on this airline. I'll be speaking to corporate about this. Mark my words." "You do that," Snoop said coolly, returning his attention to his phone. But Brooke wasn't done. She turned on her heel and stormed down the aisle, muttering under her breath about entitled people and incompetent staff. Megan let out a small sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. A few moments later, Brooke returned, flanked by the flight attendant Gary, who looked both confused and alarmed. Brooke had clearly decided that reinforcements were necessary to bolster her case. "She refuses to cooperate," Brooke announced loudly, gesturing towards Snoop as though he were a misbehaving child. "I demand that you do something about this." Gary looked at Snoop, then back at Brooke, his expression torn. He turned to Megan, silently asking for guidance. Before Megan could respond, Snoop stood up, the sudden movement drawing everyone's attention, and the cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Snoop's movements were deliberate and precise as he reached for his phone and pressed a button. The faint sound of a ringtone filled the air. "I didn't want to do this," Snoop said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He glanced at Gary and Megan, his eyes cold and calculating. "But since you've decided to escalate, I'll escalate too." He turned his back to Brooke and spoke into the phone. "Yeah, it's Snoop Dogg. I'm currently on one of your flights, and I'm having an issue with the staff. No, I'm not looking for compensation. I'm looking for accountability." The color drained from Megan's face. Gary shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasping and unclasping in front of him. Brooke frowned, clearly confused by the sudden turn of events. Snoop continued, his voice unwavering. "I'll expect a response before we take off. And if I don't get one, I'll assume this is a systemic issue and take it to the board." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Thank you." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, turning to Megan with a faint smile. "Now," he said, his voice dripping with quiet authority. "Let's see how corporate handles this." Megan swallowed hard, the weight of the situation settling fully on her shoulders. She didn't know the full extent of Snoop Dogg's influence, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a battle she wanted to lose. The first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath in the moments following Snoop's decisive phone call. The hum of the engines was the only sound that punctuated the heavy silence. Snoop returned to his seat, his expression calm, though his eyes carried a quiet fire. He picked up his leather notebook once again, flipping it open with deliberate care, as if the conversation had already been resolved in his favor. Megan Rose remained standing near the aisle, her usually confident posture faltering. The weight of Snoop's last words, "Take it to the board," echoed in her mind like a warning bell. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but something about Snoop Dogg's tone and composure told Megan this was no ordinary customer. Her instincts screamed at her to tread carefully, but the presence of Brooke Stone loomed large, demanding a resolution. Brooke, however, was not a woman accustomed to waiting or losing. She crossed her arms tightly, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her sleeve in frustration. The faint smirk she wore earlier had faded, replaced by a deep scowl. "Well?" Brooke finally broke the silence, addressing Megan with an imperious tone. "Are you just going to stand there and let this nonsense continue?" Megan hesitated, glancing at Gary, who stood behind Brooke, his posture stiff with discomfort. She knew she was walking a fine line. Choosing Brooke meant risking Snoop's wrath, potentially damaging the airline's reputation if this man truly had connections at the board level. But siding with Snoop would mean incurring the ire of a Platinum Elite member, someone the airline valued as a frequent customer. "Mrs. Nicole," Megan began cautiously, "I assure you we are handling the situation. Please take your seat for now, and I will follow up shortly." Brooke's eyes narrowed, her nostrils flaring. "Take my seat. Take my seat. I'm supposed to be in his seat." She jabbed a finger in Snoop's direction, her voice rising to a pitch that made several passengers wince. "Do you have any idea who I am?" It was a phrase Snoop had heard countless times before. He didn't even bother looking up from his notebook, flipping a page as if Brooke's tantrum was no more significant than the faint rustle of paper. His nonchalance only seemed to fuel Brooke's anger further. "I demand to speak to the captain," Brooke said sharply. "This is completely unacceptable. If you won't fix this, I'll take it up with someone who will." At the mention of the captain, Megan's composure cracked just slightly. Calling the captain into a passenger dispute was a last resort, an escalation that could disrupt the entire flight and delay departure. It wasn't a decision to be made lightly. She stepped forward, lowering her voice in an attempt to calm Brooke. "Mrs. Nicole," she said firmly, "please understand that the captain's primary concern is the safety of the flight. This matter does not warrant his involvement. Let's resolve it here." But Brooke was having none of it. "I see how it is," she snapped. "You're protecting him because you think he's more important than me. Well, let me tell you something. If I'm not in that seat by the time this plane takes off, your airline will be hearing from my lawyers." Snoop sighed softly, finally closing his notebook with a quiet thud. He placed it on his lap and looked up, his eyes meeting Brooke's, with an expression that was equal parts calm and unyielding. "Mrs. Nicole," Snoop said evenly, "if you truly believe your lawyers can resolve this, by all means proceed. But before you do, I suggest you consider the consequences of escalating a situation you're clearly not prepared to handle." Brooke blinked, momentarily thrown off by the quiet authority in Snoop's voice. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice faltering for the first time. "It means," Snoop replied, leaning forward slightly, "that throwing your weight around might work in some circles, but it won't work here. Not with me, and certainly not with the board members who will be reviewing this incident." He sat back, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. "So I suggest you take your seat before you embarrass yourself further." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Megan looked between the two, her stomach twisting into knots. She could see Brooke's face turning red, her jaw working furiously as she tried to formulate a response. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the silence. "Ladies," a deep, authoritative voice said from behind them. The captain himself had appeared at the entrance to the first-class cabin, his uniform crisp and his demeanor composed. His presence immediately commanded attention, and even Brooke fell silent. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the scene with practiced neutrality. Megan stepped forward quickly, hoping to defuse the situation before it spiraled further. "Captain, we're handling a minor seating issue. There's no need for your involvement." "I'll be the judge of that," the captain interrupted, his tone firm but calm. He turned to Brooke, who immediately launched into a tirade about her Platinum Elite status, her loyalty to the airline, and the injustice of being denied her rightful seat. The captain listened patiently, his expression giving nothing away. When Brooke finally finished, he turned to Snoop, his eyes softening slightly. "And you, sir," he asked, "do you have anything to add?" Snoop met his gaze without flinching. "No, Captain," he said simply. "I paid for this seat, and I intend to stay in it. If the airline made a mistake with Mrs. Nicole's reservation, that's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility to fix." The captain nodded, his eyes lingering on Snoop for a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned back to Brooke. "Mrs. Nicole?" he said firmly. "I understand your frustration, but this seat was properly assigned to Mr. Dogg. I must ask you to return to your assigned seat so we can proceed with the flight." Brooke stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "But that's final," the captain said, cutting her off. "If you refuse, I will have no choice but to remove you from this flight." The cabin erupted in a collective intake of breath. Brooke looked around, her eyes wild, searching for someone, anyone, to take her side, but there was no sympathy to be found. Snoop, meanwhile, picked up his notebook and opened it once again, his expression calm and unreadable. He didn't need to say anything more. The situation was already unraveling exactly as he'd expected. Brooke clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "This isn't over," she hissed, glaring at Snoop as if he were the source of all her problems. But Snoop didn't even look up, and for Brooke, that was perhaps the greatest insult of all. Brooke's furious footsteps echoed down the aisle as she begrudgingly retreated to her assigned seat. The cabin, now thick with tension, fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint rustle of passengers shifting in their seats. The captain gave a small nod to Megan, signaling that the matter was settled for now, and returned to the cockpit. Megan exhaled quietly, trying to regain her composure, knowing that the weight of the situation lingered in the air, heavier than the crisp collar of her uniform. Brooke might have been pacified temporarily, but the look in her eyes promised retribution. And then there was Snoop, silent, composed, but undeniably powerful. Megan couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. Snoop flipped open his notebook once again, his fingers tracing the edges of the leather cover as if grounding himself. His calm exterior was a practiced art, but beneath it, he felt the faint stirrings of frustration. This wasn't the first time he encountered such treatment, and though he rarely let it get under his skin, today felt different. Perhaps it was Brooke's overt entitlement or the complicit hesitation of the crew, but something in him had shifted. His phone buzzed softly in the pocket of his jacket, and he pulled it out with a quick, fluid motion. The screen lit up with a notification, "Incoming call, Marcus, Corporate Affairs." He smiled faintly. Marcus was efficient, sharp, and fiercely loyal, a trusted ally on the airline's corporate board. If anyone could address this situation swiftly, it was him. He pressed the phone to his ear, keeping his voice low to maintain discretion. "Marcus," he said, his tone steady but carrying an undertone of annoyance. "I need you to handle something." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Marcus spoke, his voice calm and professional. "I saw your message. What's going on?" Snoop glanced around the cabin, ensuring his conversation remained private. "I'm on flight 827 to Zurich. The crew just tried to pressure me into giving up my seat for another passenger, a Platinum Elite member who thinks the world revolves around her." Marcus's sharp intake of breath was audible. "They what?" "You're kidding." "I wish I were," Snoop replied. "It wasn't just a request, Marcus. It was a thinly veiled attempt to prioritize her over me because in their eyes, she's more valuable. When I refused, it escalated. They called the supervisor, who asked me again as though I hadn't already made myself clear. Marcus's tone darkened. "This is unacceptable. Do you have names?" "I do," Snoop said. "The flight attendant, Gary, the supervisor, Megan Rose, and of course our dear Mrs. Nicole." "Consider it handled," Marcus said firmly. "I'll escalate this to the CEO myself. They'll be lucky to keep their jobs by the time you land." Snoop paused, his grip on the phone tightening. "Don't stop at firing them," he said quietly. "I want a systematic review. This isn't just about me. It's about how many others have been treated like this. I'm tired of these exceptions becoming the norm." Marcus's voice softened, his respect for Snoop evident. "Understood. I'll start the process immediately. In the meantime, is there anything else you need?" Snoop hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window where the fiery hues of the sunset had faded into a soft twilight, the runway lights glimmering faintly against the deepening sky. "No," he said at last. "Just handle the rest from here." He ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. For a moment he allowed himself a deep breath, letting the familiar rhythm of his heartbeat steady his nerves. The storm wasn't over, but he had set things in motion. Now all he had to do was wait. Across the aisle, Megan watched Snoop out of the corner of her eye, her unease growing by the second. The quiet confidence with which Snoop had conducted himself wasn't just intimidating, it was unsettling. Megan had dealt with plenty of demanding passengers in her career, but none had carried the quiet authority Snoop exuded. Something about his demeanor suggested that he wasn't just another first-class traveler. Megan glanced toward the galley where Gary was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed tightly. His usual air of casual confidence all but disappeared, replaced by a nervous energy that made him fidget with his tie. Megan decided to confront him. "Gary," she said, stepping into the narrow space, "we need to talk." He straightened, his expression defensive. "About what?" "This situation," Megan said, lowering her R voice. "I don't think you realize who we're dealing with," Gary scoffed. Though the sound lacked conviction, he's just another passenger who thinks he's above everyone else. "I don't see what the big deal is," Megan frowned, her voice sharp. "He's not just another passenger, Gary. He knows someone high up. Did you see how he handled this? He didn't even raise his voice, but he's already called someone outside the chain of command." "I think we've made a mistake." Gary shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Megan's words settling over him. "You think he's connected?" "I think we need to be careful," Megan replied. "And I think you need to be prepared for the possibility that this might come back on us." Gary opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice filled the cabin, calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received an update from corporate headquarters, and we'll be making a brief delay at the gate before takeoff. We appreciate your patience, and will provide additional details shortly." The announcement sent a ripple of murmurs through the cabin. Megan's stomach dropped. A delay at this stage could only mean one thing. Corporate was already involved. She turned to Gary, her expression grim. "This isn't over," she said softly. Gary said nothing, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. For the first time, he realized that they had underestimated Snoop Dogg, and that mistake could cost them everything. The hum of the engines had quieted, replaced by the faint rustling of passengers settling into their seats. Their conversations muted as the announcement of the unexpected delay sank in. Snoop closed his notebook again, resting his hands on the leather cover. His calm demeanor remained intact, though the sharpness in his eyes hinted at the mental chess game he was already winning. He glanced out the window, the glow of the terminal lights reflecting faintly on the glass. This pause, he knew, wasn't just a coincidence. Marcus worked quickly, and if he was already pulling strings, things were about to unfold in ways no one here expected. Meanwhile, in the galley, Megan and Gary huddled in hushed tones, their earlier tension now replaced with outright fear. "I don't like this," Megan muttered, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She had spent years climbing the ranks of the airline, her reputation carefully cultivated through hard work and diplomacy. But now she could feel that foundation crumbling beneath her. That delay, it's corporate. Someone called it in. Gary leaned back against the counter, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a restless energy that made him look smaller somehow. "So what if they did?" he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's not like we did anything wrong. We asked him to move politely, and he refused. End of story." Megan shook her head. "You're missing the point. This isn't about what we think we did. It's about perception. And if he's connected to someone high enough to trigger a delay like this, that perception could destroy us." Gary scoffed, but his shifting eyes betrayed his unease. He had seen passengers threaten to escalate issues before, but none had the quiet certainty Snoop displayed. It wasn't a bluff. It was a warning. Back in the first-class cabin, Brooke Stone sat rigidly in her seat, her fingers tapping against the armrest in an impatient rhythm. The delay had done little to calm her temper. If anything, it had fanned the flames. She couldn't shake the image of Snoop's composed face, the way he had dismissed Brooke's demands as though she were insignificant. He thinks he's better than me, Brooke muttered under her breath, her lips curling into a sneer. Beside her, Lauren shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence in Brooke's cause now replaced with unease. Maybe we should just let it go, Lauren whispered, her eyes darting toward the aisle where Megan and Gary were still talking. This is getting messy. Brooke shot her a withering look. Let it go. Do you know how much money I've spent with this airline? How many hours have I logged in first class? I'm not letting some nobody make a fool of me. Lauren winced but said nothing, turning her attention to the in-flight magazine in her lap. Brooke, however, wasn't done. She leaned forward, craning her neck to catch a glimpse of Snoop, who sat serenely in his seat, his focus once again on his notebook. Unbelievable, Brooke hissed. He just sits there, acting like he owns the place. A flight attendant passed by, and Brooke flagged him down with a sharp wave of her hand. Are we taking off? She demanded, her voice cutting through the quiet cabin. This delay is unacceptable. The young man hesitated, clearly caught off guard. I'm sorry, ma'am, but the captain hasn't provided an update yet. We'll be underway shortly. Brooke waved him off with a dismissive gesture, muttering under her breath as he retreated down the aisle. Snoop didn't so much as glance in her direction, but Brooke's anger simmered hotter with every passing second. 15 minutes later, the stillness of the cabin was broken by the soft hiss of the cabin door opening. Two sharply dressed men in suits stepped inside, their presence immediately drawing attention. One carried a sleek briefcase while the other held a tablet in one hand, his expression unreadable. Snoop's gaze flicked toward them, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. Marcus never disappointed. The taller of the two men scanned the cabin briefly before his eyes landed on Megan, who had stepped forward instinctively at their arrival. Miss Lane, he asked, his voice low but commanding. Megan nodded, her throat dry. Yes, I'm Megan Rose, the flight supervisor. Can I help you? We're with corporate, the man said, holding up an ID badge. We need to speak with you and the rest of your team immediately. Gary, who had been lingering nearby, froze mid-step. His face paled as he exchanged a glance with Megan, who looked equally unsettled. Is there a problem? Megan asked, though she already knew the answer. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the galley. We'll speak privately now. Megan and Gary exchanged another look before following the men into the galley, their movements stiff and uncertain. As the door to the cabin closed behind them, a ripple of murmurs spread through the passengers. Even Brooke sat straighter, craning her neck to see what was happening. Snoop, meanwhile, remained perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on his notebook. He didn't need to see what was happening in the galley. He already knew how this story would end. The gears were in motion, and there was no stopping them now. Inside the galley, the air was thick with tension. The two corporate representatives stood with practiced composure, their eyes sharp and assessing as they addressed Megan and Gary. We reviewed the situation, the taller man began, his voice even but cold. And we've spoken with key stakeholders regarding this flight. Effective immediately, both of you are being removed from duty. Megan's eyes widened in shock. Removed? There's no room for negotiation, the man cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. Your conduct has been deemed unprofessional and inconsistent with the airline's policies. Further disciplinary action will be determined following a full investigation. Gary's mouth opened and closed, his usual arrogance replaced by sheer panic. You can't be serious. This is a misunderstanding. We didn't do anything wrong. The second man, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. We've reviewed passenger testimony and corporate records, he said firmly. Your actions jeopardize the integrity of this flight and the airline's reputation. This decision is final. Megan felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her years of service, her carefully built career, gone in an instant. Gary, meanwhile, had gone pale, his hands trembling as he tried to form a coherent response. You're to leave the aircraft immediately, the first man said, gesturing toward the cabin door. Security is waiting outside to escort you. As the two stunned crew members were led out of the galley, Snoop turned his head slightly, watching them from the corner of his eye. The faintest trace of satisfaction flickered across his face, but he quickly masked it, returning his attention to the notebook. The sound of Brooke's indignant voice rose once again, but this time it barely registered. Snoop had already won the battle, and he knew the war was over too. The cabin door closed behind Megan and Gary, the sound a sharp punctuation to the tension that had gripped the plane. For the first time since the commotion began, a hush fell over the first-class cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering among themselves, though no one dared to speak loudly enough to be overheard. Snoop remained seated, his posture relaxed, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. He knew better than to revel in the moment. It wasn't in his nature to gloat. Instead, he focused on what mattered most, the larger message this incident would send. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. The two corporate representatives emerged from the galley and made their way down the aisle. One of them stopped at Snoop's seat, inclining his head respectfully. "Mr. Dogg," he said softly, "everything has been resolved. Please accept our deepest apologies for the inconvenience and the way you were treated. The individuals involved are no longer part of this flight." Snoop met his gaze evenly, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate the swift action," he said, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that made the man straighten slightly. "However, I trust this won't end here. I expect a full review of the airline's policies and training procedures. This isn't the first time I've seen something like this, and I doubt it will be the last." "Of course, sir," the man replied quickly. "We'll ensure that happens. You have my word." Snoop nodded once, his attention shifting back to his notebook as if dismissing him. The man hesitated for a moment before retreating down the aisle, leaving Snoop to his thoughts. He didn't need their promises. He had the influence to ensure they followed through, and he intended to use it. Across the cabin, Brooke was seething, her face flushed, her fingers clutching the armrest so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The smug satisfaction she had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by a simmering rage that seemed to radiate off her in waves. "This is ridiculous," Brooke hissed under her breath. "Absolutely ridiculous." Lauren, seated beside her, leaned in cautiously. "Maybe it's best if we just let it go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not worth causing more trouble." Brooke turned on her sharply, her eyes blazing. "Let it go? Do you realize what just happened? They threw me under the bus. I'm a Platinum Elite member. Do you have any idea how much I spend on this airline every year? And they're treating me like him." She spat the last word as though it were venomous, jerking her chin toward Snoop's seat. Lauren recoiled slightly, her gaze darting toward Snoop, who remained utterly unbothered. If Snoop had heard Brooke's outburst, he gave no indication of it. His calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Brooke's anger further. "This isn't over," Brooke muttered, her tone dark. "I'll make sure corporate hears about this. I have connections." Lauren sighed, her unease growing. Brooke's refusal to back down was beginning to feel less like determination and more like desperation. She didn't dare voice her thoughts, though. Not with Brooke in this state. The intercom crackled to life once more and the captain's voice filled the cabin, steady and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. As a reminder, safety and customer satisfaction are our top priorities. We'll be resuming our departure shortly. Thank you for your patience." The announcement seemed routine, but Snoop noticed the subtle shift in tone, a hint of finality that signaled the flight crew had been instructed to ensure there were no further disruptions. The cabin doors remained closed now, and the faint tension in the air began to dissipate as passengers settled back into their routines. But for Brooke, the captain's words were the final straw. She stood abruptly, her sudden movement drawing the attention of those around her. Her voice cut through the relative quiet, loud and indignant. "This is unacceptable," she declared, glaring down the aisle as if the corporate representatives might magically reappear. "I've been a loyal customer of this airline for years, and this is how I'm treated? I demand to speak to someone in charge now." Several heads turned, passengers exchanging uneasy glances. Even Lauren looked embarrassed, sinking lower in her seat as if she could disappear entirely. Before anyone could respond, one of the corporate representatives returned, his expression unreadable. He approached Brooke with deliberate calm, his voice low but firm. "Mrs. Nicole," he said, "we've been informed that your behavior has disrupted the cabin environment. Unfortunately, we must ask you to disembark the plane." The words hung in the air heavy with finality. Brooke's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't be serious," she sputtered. "You're removing me for what? For standing up for myself?" The man remained unmoved. "Our priority is ensuring a safe and comfortable experience for all passengers. Your conduct has made that difficult. Security is waiting outside to escort you from the plane." Brooke's face turned a deep shade of red, her anger boiling over. "This is outrageous. Do you have any idea who I am?" The man didn't flinch. "Your status as a Platinum Elite member has been noted. However, it does not exempt you from following airline policies or respecting other passengers." For a moment, Brooke looked as though she might argue further, but the murmurs spreading through the cabin made her hesitate. She glanced around, realizing for the first time that she had lost whatever sympathy she might have had. The other passengers' expressions ranged from disinterest to thinly veiled satisfaction. No one was on her side. Snoop didn't even look up from his notebook as Brooke was escorted down the aisle, her protests growing fainter with each step. The door to the cabin opened briefly, the sound of security guards speaking in low tones filtering in before it closed again, leaving behind only silence. The plane finally began its taxi to the runway, the hum of the engines returning as the tension dissipated entirely. Snoop glanced out the window, the distant lights of the terminal shrinking as they moved forward. He allowed himself a small smile, calm, satisfied, and entirely self-assured. He had said nothing to Brooke directly, but his presence alone had been enough. Snoop understood that true power didn't require loud declarations or public victories. Sometimes it was the quiet resolve to stand firm and let the system correct itself. As the plane lifted off into the night sky, Snoop leaned back in his seat, his mind already shifting to the work ahead. This incident, he knew, was just the beginning. There was much to be done to ensure no one else experienced what he had. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Karma, he thought, had a way of working itself out. The cabin door closed with a final resolute hiss as Megan and Gary were escorted off the plane. The passengers who had been murmuring quietly fell silent once more, their gazes shifting toward the first-class cabin where Snoop sat. Snoop's calm demeanor remained unchanged, though his presence now carried a weight that no one could ignore. Brooke, sitting stiffly in her seat, let out a huff of disbelief. "Well," she said loudly, crossing her arms, "I hope they replace them with someone competent. This delay is ridiculous." Snoop, who had remained silent throughout Megan and Gary's removal, finally looked up, his gaze resting on Brooke with quiet intent. There was no anger, no malice, only an unyielding strength that seemed to cut through Brooke's facade. "You still don't get it, do you?" Snoop said softly, his voice carrying effortlessly in the tense cabin. Brooke blinked, caught off guard by the sudden directness. "Excuse me?" "This wasn't just about a seat," Snoop continued, his tone calm but firm. "It was about respect, about the way you and others like you think the world should bend to your will, no matter who it hurts. But today, you learned that's not how things work." Brooke opened her mouth to respond, but Snoop held up a hand, silencing her. "You assumed I was less than you because I didn't fit the image you expected to see in this seat, and you used your privilege to try to take something that wasn't yours." The other passengers watched in stunned silence as Snoop's words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. Brooke's face reddened, her composure slipping as she sputtered for a response. "I didn't mean," she began, but Snoop interrupted her. "You did," Snoop said simply, "and now you get to live with the consequences." Before Brooke could retort, one of the corporate representatives re-entered the cabin, his expression unreadable as he approached Snoop's seat. "Mr. Dogg," he said respectfully, "we've taken care of the situation. On behalf of the airline, I'd like to extend our sincerest apologies for the unacceptable treatment you received today." Snoop nodded politely but didn't smile. "I trust you'll be conducting a full review of your staff's training and policies," he asked, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Absolutely," the man replied. "We'll be implementing new protocols immediately, and as a gesture of goodwill, the airline would like to offer you complimentary first-class travel for the next 2 years." Snoop inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said. "But what I really want is accountability, not just for me, but for every passenger who's been made to feel less than because of who they are." The man nodded, his respect for Snoop evident. "You have my word." As the corporate representative turned to leave, Brooke leaned forward, her indignation boiling over. "Wait a minute," she snapped. "What about me? I'm the one who's been inconvenienced here. I'm a Platinum Elite member. Do you know how much money I've spent on this airline?" The representative turned to her, his expression cool. "Mrs. Nicole," he said, his voice polite but firm, "your behavior today was documented by multiple witnesses. The airline has decided to revoke your Platinum Elite status effective immediately." Brooke's jaw dropped, her face turning pale. "You can't do that. I have rights." "You do," the man replied calmly, "and so does every other passenger. Your actions today violated the airline's code of conduct, and we take that very seriously. Security will escort you off the plane now." The cabin erupted into whispers as two uniformed security guards appeared at the door. Brooke protested loudly, her voice rising in pitch as she demanded to speak to someone in charge, but her words fell on deaf ears as she was led away, her protests fading into the distance. The plane finally began to taxi down the runway, the delay a distant memory as the passengers settled back into their seats. Snoop gazed out the window, the soft glow of the city lights below casting a faint reflection on the glass. The silence around him felt heavier now, not the awkward quiet of earlier, but a kind of reverent stillness. Though no one said it aloud, the other passengers seemed to recognize that they had witnessed something significant. Snoop Dogg, without raising his voice or resorting to anger, had stood his ground and changed the course of the day. As the plane lifted into the night sky, Snoop leaned back in his seat, his notebook resting on his lap. He didn't smile, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. He had fought this battle not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small. Weeks later, the airline released a public statement announcing new diversity and inclusivity training for all staff, along with stricter protocols for handling passenger disputes. The incident on Flight 827 was never mentioned by name, but those who knew understood that it had been a turning point. This was more than just a victory. It was a lesson. Respect isn't just a courtesy, it's a requirement, and those who forget it will always inevitably face the consequences. And just like that, the tables turned. What started as a simple act of entitlement ended with a powerful lesson in respect and humility. This story reminds us all, no matter who you are, treating others with dignity is non-negotiable. If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to like and share to spread the message. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.